I observed for as long as I could. They are overly policed and incarcerated. All over the planet, our people suffer because they don't have the tools to fight back.
Fruitvale Station, Creed, and Black Panther. 3 Ryan Coogler films that have a lot in common. For one thing, they all star Michael B. Jordan, but that's more than just trivia or coincidence. Together, Coogler and Jordan have teamed up to tell stories about abandonment, inheritance, and legacy, ideas worth keeping in mind while watching Black Panther: Wakanda Forever, which also had the responsibility of dealing with the passing of Chadwick Boseman and the legacy that he and his character T'Challa leave behind. Coogler frames these themes in 2 key ways. They're about feeling abandoned, about what people inherit, and about what they leave behind, not just as individuals, through stories of fathers and children, but as people who feel abandoned by countries and structures as well. They're about how ideas like legacy and inheritance can apply to societies, and the result is a fascinating filmography with some of the most exciting mainstream sequels and spin-offs in recent memory, as Coogler himself inherits other people's stories and shapes them in his own uniquely personal way. The story of Fruitvale Station is a tragic one. Opening with footage of the real-life Oakland police shooting of Oscar Grant, a 22-year-old Bay Area native, in the early hours on New Year's Day in 2009, Coogler, who lived just north of Oakland and was the same age as Oscar, wanted to tell his story. And while he builds up to Oscar's eventual killing, he also tells a detailed account of his last day alive, which he wrote after working closely with Grant's family. But Fruitvale Station isn't about painting Oscar as a saint. It's a character portrait of a man's struggle to be better, despite the mistakes he's made and continues to make. And it's a larger statement about what's lost when lives like Oscar's are cut short.
It only takes 30 days to form a habit, and then it becomes second nature.
Before we see any footage, we first hear a conversation between Oscar, played by Jordan, and his girlfriend Sofina, about how it takes 30 days to form a habit, a conversation that comes up later in the movie too. As the film goes on, Oscar makes various decisions to try and form new habits so he can be a better boyfriend to Sofina and a better father to their daughter Tatiana. You can see the beginnings of this process between Oscar coming clean about losing his job and promising to be honest from there on out, and him nearly going back to his old ways of selling drugs, albeit to help with his sister's rent, before he gets rid of his last remaining stash and begins a new path. But as much as the film is set up as a story of a man's 30-day journey, we only ever get to see him take the very first steps, before the opportunity to turn his life around is stolen from him. A haunting specter Coogler keeps reminding us of with his lingering shots of BART stations and trains. Coogler shows us where Oscar has been through his prison flashbacks, and we see where he could potentially go, helping a woman out at a store while he tries to get his job back, since finding a new one could be next to impossible as a convicted felon. When a fight breaks out on the BART train, which eventually leads to the cops being called, it's in a moment when his future and past collide, representing the best and worst parts of himself, when he runs into both the woman from the store as well as his old prison adversaries. Along the way, Coogler paints moments of joy and struggle as he and Jordan bring a version of Oscar to the screen that's both tender and confrontational, a vulnerable contradiction trying to solve itself, just like any of us. Whether or not these events all took place on the same day, it feels like Coogler has collapsed an entire lifetime's worth of conflicts and conversations into one 24-hour period. And since we already know how it ends, each scene becomes injected with a kind of existential weight, as if everything Oscar does is the most important thing he'll ever do. It's both deeply tragic and deeply profound. There are, of course, some techniques that scream first-time feature filmmaker. Coogler's documentarian camera never fully lands on any specific emotional information during group scenes, or when he cuts to Oscar's prison flashback, a scene that feels unmotivated rather than being tethered to some definite event in the present. But there are just as many hallmarks that feel fully formed, which Coogler also uses in later films. Fruitvale Station is a movie that collapses time, but Coogler knows exactly when to use slow motion, which is to say, when Oscar is in motion, to make beautiful moments with his daughter feel infinite. And the way Coogler directs and captures Jordan's lived-in performance makes the film feel nuanced and completely human. Initially, Coogler didn't want to use the real footage of Grant's killing, since he and his Bay Area community were already so familiar with the event, but it functions as a way of bringing people into the story from the outside, exposing them to the images that first made him want to tell Oscar's story. He also introduces places and timelines using the Courier typeface that's not only used in screenplays but was once used in official government documents, as if his version of events is a counter-narrative to the one usually spun about black victims of police violence. He's putting their full humanity on display instead of just the moments leading up to their deaths. Arguably, Coogler's most powerful use of real footage comes at the very end of the movie, when the last images we see are of Oscar's family at real-world demonstrations, and real pictures of his daughter Tatiana, who's left to live in the aftermath of the events. The kind of devastating emotional hole he would go on to explore with his next two films.
When your father died, I was angry for so long. You are your father's son. But it doesn't mean you have to be him.
It's hard to bring something new to a long-running franchise, especially one as old and beloved as Rocky. Creed is essentially Rocky 7, but right from the get-go, it comes from a personal place. It begins in LA, not far from where Coogler grew up, in a juvenile detention facility, the kind where his father worked, and where Coogler himself would go on to work even after graduating film school. When the story begins, Adonis Johnson, aka Donnie, is like all the other kids in this facility, abandoned by families, the system, or both, and he's seen fighting as a way to survive. But when the wife of Donnie's birth father, Apollo Creed, offers him a home and a way out, you see his fist loosen for the first time. For a moment, it seems like this extension of love and acceptance might break the cycle of violence, but the next few times we see Donnie, his hands tell an uneasy story. Whether because of his blood or because of the circumstances of his childhood, violence is now a part of him, and it's a path he must follow. Breaking the chain is going to be much harder than a single gesture. Violence is part of Donnie's inheritance, and Coogler lays out the battle that lies ahead of him in deeply moving, deeply cinematic fashion, as he shadowboxes against projected footage of an old fight between Rocky and Apollo from Rocky II. The film's meta-commentary on legacy comes into play as well, since Jordan and Coogler are inheriting the mantle of the franchise, and the editing from the original film becomes part of Creed's fabric, forming a roadmap for its story. Sometimes Donnie is fighting against his father, struggling with his abandonment and rejecting his name. Other times, his father is projected onto him, and he steps into his shoes, becoming part of that legacy. In the same way, he's also fighting with and against Rocky, who he tracks down in Philadelphia because he's the closest thing he has to a father figure. When Rocky realizes who Donnie is, Coogler doesn't give us this information in words, but through the way Rocky reflects on an image of the past, an image of that very same fight from Rocky II.
Come on, let's do this.
The idea of reflecting on the past is even embedded in the soundtrack. Donnie and Rocky's first training montage is set to Bridging the Gap by rapper Nas and his jazz musician father, Olu Dara, in which they talk about the evolution of music from blues to jazz to hip-hop, essentially the legacy and inheritance of black art in America. It's not unlike the way Creed itself feels like an evolution of Rocky, a sports story that inherits its working-class Philadelphia setting, only now its images of the city cast a wider net to reflect the black working-class experience too. Like all the Rocky sequels, Creed is also about the passage of time, in quite the opposite way that Fruitvale Station is. Where Fruitvale collapses Oscar's story into a single defining day, Creed tells a story about time spanning in both directions, starting with the way Rocky has seen time defeat him by claiming everyone in his life, leaving him with no outlook on the future at all. It's about the way the past, even things that happened decades ago before we were born, can have ripple effects in the present, setting us up for our biggest hurdles, and the film also has a few hints about where those ripples could lead in the future. These come courtesy of Tessa Thompson's Bianca, not only because she's a love interest, but because as a musician with progressive hearing loss that's only going to get worse, she's being consumed and even hurt by her biggest passions, not unlike Donnie.
It makes me feel alive.
After an entire movie's worth of using old iconography, including a version of Apollo's classic trunks, which helped Donnie accept both parts of his legacy, the movie revisits arguably the most famous location from the series, the steps of the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And as Donnie and Rocky stand atop them, echoing the past, Rocky says,
You know, if you look hard enough, you can see your whole life from up here.
Here, Coogler creates one of those unique moments where he could be talking about the past or about the future. Either way, he's talking about it with a sense of clarity, something he and Donnie have both arrived at after confronting the way the past has hurt them. The past now seems clear, and for once, so does the future.
I've been fighting my whole life. I ain't got a choice. I lived my entire life waiting for this moment.
It's always about a choice.
However, where Creed is a story about a man dealing with the ghost of a father he never met, Coogler's third and most famous film is about two men dealing with the losses of fathers they knew and confronting what they left behind.
Maybe he wanted to go out like a fighter. Maybe you did exactly what he wanted.
I think he'd rather be here, talking with you.
Like many Marvel movies, Black Panther can get a little messy at times, with fight scenes that feel weightless, and themes are just stated plainly, with staging and dialogue that are just as plain, instead of those themes manifesting symbolically or dramatically. But there are also plenty of moments where the film feels like a personal vision. For one thing, Coogler was allowed to bring his heightened visual touches to several moments, like the way villains seem to emerge from dark voids, and his ingeniously staged one-take fight scenes. For another, Black Panther also feels like a continuation of the story Coogler has already been telling. For instance, he changes Killmonger's origin in the comics as a kid born in Wakanda and raised in Harlem, and aligns it more closely with his own background, setting his opening scene against a backdrop of the 1992 LA riots after the police beating of Rodney King. Eric is a Bay Area native, and like in Fruitvale Station, we get a glimpse of what his story would or should have been before any footage appears. His father regales him with the history of Wakanda, a place that ought to be his home, but his father also knows that he's going to be treated as an outsider. As an outsider, Eric's cultural inheritance is taken from him, like the inheritance of so many people from the African continent. His life turns out quite differently from cousin T'Challa, who gets to be king of Wakanda when his father dies. And while T'Challa certainly has his own dilemmas about how best to rule, the symbolism of what each man inherits is made clear by the visual staging. For T'Challa, the act of inheritance is ritualized in grand fashion, and when he visits the ancestral plane, he's met with wide open spaces and infinite possibilities. However, when Eric visits this same spiritual realm, those possibilities are blocked off from him by the four walls of the tiny Oakland apartment where he found his father's body, a moment of trauma that would set him down a lifelong path of violence and revenge. T'Challa almost went down a similar path in Captain America: Civil War. But since his arc was resolved in that film, Coogler gets to focus more on T'Challa as a political figure and the leader of a global superpower. As much as Wakanda is presented as an Afro-futurist fantasy with Pan-African culture being woven into advanced technology, the debates about how it should integrate itself with the rest of the world, if at all, are distinctly American, at a time when they were on everyone's minds. The kingdom represents what America at its best should do to help other people, while Eric's story represents the flip side to that coin. His father may have been killed by a Wakandan king, but Eric's life was denied by the death he saw all around him as a child, a result of deep institutional failures he hopes to correct.
No tears for me?
Everybody dies. It's just life around here.
And while Eric's righteous story ends up going in a particularly Marvel-esque direction, where the villains have a point and the heroes oppose their methods but don't really change anything, Black Panther may also be the first and probably only MCU story where we actually see the villain affect the hero's perspective, causing him to act for the betterment of the people the villain claimed to be fighting for. It's a small step and not anywhere near what Eric had in mind when it came to freeing people from oppression, but it's another personal touch from Coogler. Wakanda putting educational resources back into Eric's old neighborhood isn't just poetic, but a reflection of a dream Coogler himself had as far back as 2007, when he sought to bring the film business into poor Oakland neighborhoods as an alternative to poverty and crime.
My pop said Wakanda was the most beautiful thing you ever seen. He promised he was going to show it to me one day.
Whether working on sequels or spin-offs for a studio, or whether telling tragic real-life stories, Coogler always pours part of himself into his work. With the passing of his friend and collaborator Chadwick Boseman being woven into Wakanda Forever, the Black Panther sequel is the rare moment where these worlds and perspectives collide, with another villain whose sense of loss drives him to wage war, and with characters dealing with the death of a heroic figure, and what he meant to them both as a symbol and as a person. It's a difficult story to tell, but as a story of legacy and what we leave behind, there's no better person to tell it than Ryan Coogler.
What are you afraid of?
I'm afraid of taking on the name and losing.
Well, look at what I've done. We are both abandoned here.
You're still caught in the shadow. Gotta move, Donnie.